Hello, and welcome to Spotlight On, the podcast that brings together business leaders, entrepreneurs, and experts covering a range of topics. I'm Nicholas Barton, founder and CEO of the Barton Partnership. We're an award-winning executive recruitment and consulting solutions firm providing permanent search and independent consulting services across strategy, sustainability and M&A, data and analytics, and transformation and change.
Hello, and welcome to Barton Partnership's Spotlight On podcast. I'm Harry Chamberlain, VP in our US private equity practice. Joining me today is Geza Garai. Geza has worked across multiple different private equity-owned portfolio companies as a chief transformation officer. He has worked with sponsors including Advent International, Platinum Equity, Centerbridge, and Newbank Capital. Geza, as always, it is fantastic to see you and an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. And given your wealth of experience in the PE transformation space, really looking forward to digging into some of these topics today. To kick us off, as someone who has done the CTO 3 to 4 times now, what do you see as the high-level role of the CTO?
By the way, Harry, always enjoying conversations. So I'm glad we can discuss these things today. The high level role of the CTO, I think there's a book definition, right? It's ultimately driving value creation. So there's a lot around project management, but I do believe that transformation, to be successful and to deliver impact, it has to go beyond just managing projects, or acting as often as a chief of staff to the CEO. And I do like to think about 3 things that are relevant for success. The first one is execution. So, one of the key things that matter is how do you bring together cross-functional teams to deliver sustainable or short-term impact. So ultimately, the goal is to expand the EBITDA, maybe add initiatives that make the company valuation higher. But there are times when there's a need to take short-term action to bolster, finances or cash flows. A good example for that one would be COVID in 2020. I was in a couple of those initiatives. So there's a lot around identifying opportunities, developing the business case, creating the structure, the cadence, managing any resource conflicts or removing roadblocks. A lot around reporting. So this is the what I would call execution. The second major bucket is around challenge. Transformation can play a very important role in looking around the corner, 2-3 steps down the road. What could be the potential risks? What could be the potential opportunities? If it is related to risks, how do we run to the fire as a team? So a lot around anticipation, challenging the organization, asking probing questions, ensuring that the view we have is not only inward looking, but there's a good amount of external perspective. And, ultimately relentlessly asking, what are we solving for? What do we say no to? So beyond execute and challenge, I think the third piece that's relevant, there's building. It's around norms, cultural values for the organization. And I would not say that transformation will develop, a new culture, but it can play an important role in shifting the culture, strengthening values that will help transition and build an ultimately better executing organization. There's a lot around ownership and accountability. So how do we increase the sense of ownership and get people more comfortable around accountability conversations? Silos, due to the nature of the cross-functional work, are always a potential roadblock, and finding ways to connect various pieces of the organization is very important. And there's a good amount of developing talent, attracting people to the right initiatives, pull the ones that are high performers into opportunities. There's coaching. It's a new environment in many cases when transformation gets involved. So making people understand how they fit into the picture, what are better reactions to the challenges. I think that there's a lot transformation can do there.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And I like the point about running towards the fire and sort of embracing the challenges. And I imagine that the COVID pandemic of 2020 was a great example there. I mean, how did you handle that situation in your chief transformation officer role then?
So there were 2 areas where transformation got involved. The first one is, if you think back, it's March, April 2020. It's a brand new world. We have to figure out who can go to the office. How do we maintain operations, any new regulations, we have to be aware of what are some sort of employee responses. So there's a very cross-functional discussion happening initially by email between the multiple parts of the organization, but there's a way to bring it all together and start running a regular cadence on, here's the list of issues, this is the playbook that we now start developing on how to respond, incorporate new challenges, make sure that the right people get involved in the conversation. So we were doing a lot of that, ensuring that we don't drop the ball on any new requirements, and if there's opportunities, we capture them proactively. And the second piece is in the business I was in was not favored by the COVID environment. So we had to look at what are the short-term actions we can take on improving cost performance or any actions that we can take on minimizing the negative impact on our cash flows. So then you build it's almost like a mini VCP around short-term opportunities. So you set a target, you identify the initiatives to size them, prioritize them, resource them, and start running a cadence around reporting on progress, measuring the impact, and ensuring that you hit the target. So those are the two things that I spent quite a bit of time. I guess it's 3 years now.
So it's a great example of almost having a sort of ready-built crisis management office, and I'm sure similar roles will play a crucial part in future instances of similar situations as well. What value do you feel the CTO brings in the context of private equity? Why do private equity funds use chief transformation officers? I
think transformation officers bring focus to value creation. And I think that impact is on an organizational level. So there's clearly a message around we are dedicating resources to enable transformation and to support it. And I think on the individual level, a transformation officer can embody the spirit of transformation. So, the factors we talked about earlier, from breaking down silos to bring cross-functional teams together, improve the execution of initiatives, being a lot more structured around measuring impact, reporting, meeting efficiencies. So I think there's a way for transformation to sort of embody that and focus the organization.
We so often see the chief transformation officer as the extension of a PE portfolio operations group. And sometimes they're in place of them where funds don't have it, but very often it is there to almost balance the needs and desires of the funds and the capability of management, and sort of pay that crucial pivot. What backgrounds do people typically look to hire? And you've obviously built out a few transformation offices. What backgrounds do they look to hire people from, and what potential pitfalls can one fall into when hiring a chief transformation officer and then building out that function?
The most obvious that comes to mind, and I'm not saying that because I have some background in that, but working in consulting provides many of the tools that are very helpful, from structuring problems, developing business cases, reporting, running a cadence, how to do a steering committee meeting, how to have the right level of conversation. So consultants can bring very significant experience to that will benefit transformation. The other part that's important is the ability to work from within a portfolio company. So, as ex-consultants like myself, when you find yourself surrounded by the team within the portfolio company with very level dose of skills, motivation, but the output still has to meet the requirements of the sponsor and the leadership team, is sort of like finding the right connection to bring it all together. I think that's a different skill set. So personally, I benefited from my background in working in the corporate world on large initiatives, often with small teams, so a lot of influencing, but not as a consultant, but as part of the internal team. So that definitely comes very handy when one is within the portfolio environment. The pitfall can be that there's maybe two sets of pitfalls. The one is finding the right candidate who can be effective in the portfolio environment. So many initiatives I was a part of, it's a very, very small team, 1, 2, maybe 3, transformation officers, maybe a couple of analysts. Beyond that, it's the rest of the organization that has to be involved in supporting and brought together. So that can be challenging for somebody who comes straight from the consulting world, where they can rely on a team of very high performing individuals with the right level of motivation. And so I think that could be a shift there, and I would check for that. The other one is just with any hire is checking potential biases on what we over-index on. Industry is always or sector is always a valid question. Is for the transformation officer, how deep would they have to be into the sector or the industry of the portfolio company? I think that's something that's worth checking for. I personally argue for, maybe it's less important than it may appear initially. And the other one is, based on the VCP or the investment thesis, will there be specific areas where the candidate has to, bring actual functional knowledge? So if it's a very supply chain heavy situation, or there's a lot on growth initiatives and go to market, again, it's worth checking to what extent are we indexing on that. And there can be cases when that's incredibly important. In other cases, the agenda will shift. And what seems to be the initial focus, over a year or two may shift into something else. So having a candidate with, more of a generalist view may be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one typically sees the CTO being pretty cross-functional, but there are situations where you're going to have a bias towards more heavy on commercial and revenue topics versus more heavy on cost and operational topics. So I think that's a very interesting point. How can one truly assess a good chief transformation officer in interview? What are some of those really key points that you would look for?
My previous answers probably sort of uncovered that I'm always very interested in understanding the relationship between what I would call hard skills around, being very effective in delivering impact against, very quantifiable, objectives and building the, if you will, the machine around it. So there's, that's obviously a big area to check, what I would call the math. Is this person, or are they getting a very high rating on their, based on their past experience on being able to deliver on that? And the other one is engagement. So ability to influence, but going beyond, coach, build teams, facilitating the culture change we talked about earlier, and get embedded into the team as somebody who's viewed both as the driver of change, but at the same time, is able to build a natural connection with the organization, to be able to kind of pull them along on the journey. I think that's almost equally as important. So an ideal candidate would be very highly rated on both. So in that upper right quadrant, if you think about a matrix, that's where I would try to land when looking for a CTO.
Yeah, it's so true. I think on some of the searches we've seen historically, you'll sometimes find individuals who are so good at the influencing game, but just lack the ability to truly execute and crunch the numbers and roll up their sleeves and vice versa. You can't have just one or the other. It's so important to have both. And I think that's why a lot of individuals will lean to that strategy consulting toolkit and backgrounds as quite a typical natural path to build both of those toolkits.
And what I would add to that, and I think that's also sort of like one of the success drivers, but so therefore it's important to look at it upfront, is the ability to shift based on the circumstance, based on the life cycle of the investment or the given situation. So that is a good CTO is cannot just do one, but also not only do both, but be able to adapt to the situation that they're in between the harder skills and the softer skills. So it's a very interesting balancing act. Yeah,
absolutely. It's that almost empathy of understanding who you're dealing with, whether it's carrot or stick or numbers versus persuasion. There's so many different types of individuals within any size of organization that you have to know how to work with and convince. What do you see as the markers of a successful CTO?
Transformation is, don't want to state the obvious, but it's challenging. It always wants to get off track. There are a few situations when it just keeps, exponentially growing and improving. In most situations, the tendency is to kind of wear off, maybe let off a little bit, and either get distracted or reduce the energy on these initiatives. So there's always this need to pull transformation back on track. And what gets transformation back on track is there's not one good answer to it. So what we just talked about is this balancing act of what works best in a given situation. What conversations do we have with whom, or how do we find the best way to tell the story of what's not working, and then choosing the right reaction to that, whether it's a formal discussion, one-on-one discussion, if you produce a 10-page deck that really makes the case for the numbers, or a couple of good examples. So there's many things one can do. So a successful CTO probably has almost a playbook on how they respond to situations. They have exercised this capability many times over in the past years, and are able to show how they responded to the various challenges on the journey, and were able to kept the organization on track to deliver results. So I think that's the story I would be most interested in, beyond hard numbers and facts and somebody's record.
We've talked a lot about influencing and different approaches and styles that people have. What do you see as the necessary personality traits and soft skills?
So in no particular order, what I would think about is resilience, focus on objectives, be very driven by what is it that we're trying to achieve, the context and how the large pieces fit together, and maintaining that focus, I think is crucial for this role. Transparency, and it's not only expecting transparency from the organization, but being transparent. As much as there's clearly sometimes a lot of confidential information that has to be managed, but it's more around the ability to connect on the opportunities, to be able to tell a very, very compelling and straightforward and transparent story on why we do what we do, I think is a very important skill. Appropriately changing roles. So what we just talked about, from how you're on a steering meeting versus how you have a coaching conversation with somebody, or how do you sit down and develop a model to track multiple initiatives in smart sheets. So always being able to find the next most valuable thing one can do and switch into that role. So that flexibility can be difficult, because I think most of us, when we're at the 30,000 foot view versus 5,000, making that change, sometimes multiple times in an hour in the course of a conversation, does require a good amount of flexibility. And then the one that I'm mentioning last is maybe the most important one, is curiosity. A good transformation officer wants to know, how do we make money? What do our customers want? How do we reach them the best way? How has the organization evolved over time? One great thing about transformation is you get to work with some very interesting companies and very interesting businesses, and there's always something on their journey that can be very relevant to how we tackle problems today. So I always like to understand that better. But also, who is the person sitting across from me? What motivates them? What do they bring to the table? Do they have a good understanding of what we're trying to achieve, and how do I help sell the case on what happens? And how do we keep finding ways of communicating better with the organization, the individuals, the multiple stakeholders that come into way? So I think curiosity is the one that I would really like to see in transformation.
Yeah, and you mentioned multiple stakeholders, and it's a really interesting point, because so many of those traits tie in with the fact that this individual is probably going to be managing multiple different people, whether it's a combination of different C-suite leaders and or operating team, deal team at a fund level. It's really interesting to think about how those personality traits will play into almost multiple different bosses or dotted lines that you might have across the institution.
One quick point on that is, I've been in situations. So when you work with the sponsor, the operations team, the deal team, then there's a leadership team. But I work for places where there's multiple entities across the globe in various areas, which multiplies the number of stakeholders with same agenda or different agenda sometimes. So having effective conversations in those situations and being very clear on the message and finding the best way to communicate, whether it's progress or challenges or opportunities or risks, is very challenging, but personally, I find it to be a very interesting and rewarding part of what transformation does.
Absolutely. Do you think that the Chief Transformation Officer is applicable in all situations, be that industry, situation of investment? Do you feel there's areas where it is more or less applicable?
There are situations when it's less applicable. So I don't think it's I don't think it's a uniform solution to drive and deliver change. I think the factors that come to mind on that is obviously the investment thesis. So, is there a VC plan established maybe potentially by third parties before? What's behind it? Growth initiatives, cost, opportunities, or key enablers. So, go-to-market, pricing, supply chain, procurement, and whether there's third parties involved in delivering those, if there's multiple third parties involved in helping guide that, the past ownership structure. So often there's a change in style, whether it's been a company that has been owned by another PE firm before and their management style, or privately owned firm. So there's a change there. So oftentimes there is, a potential bridging opportunity and transformation that a CTO can drive the leadership team. So bandwidth, will they be able to pick up the initiatives? Would you need dedicated resources to manage that? Capabilities as well. Oftentimes it may be a very high performing team that the sponsor is very comfortable with in terms of, ability to deliver, or, there's a complementary need transformation can bring. So I think those are the factors one should carefully assess when making the decision to ensure that there's a good ROI on bringing in a CTO.
Yeah, absolutely. And ROI is at the forefront of these decisions in every perspective for sponsors. And fascinating to hear your perspective, having obviously done it in a few different industries now. What do you see as the career path beyond the Chief Transformation Officer? I don't think it's necessarily one that is neatly or sort of clearly defined in the market. What have you seen, and what have you seen others in your network move towards after being a CTO?
So oftentimes it's multiple opportunities being a CTO, because I think the role itself evolves based on the size, based on the challenge. I worked for a couple of opportunities, and the differences are probably greater than the similarities. So it's always a new challenge, and there's always an ability to learn and challenge oneself. So I think that's an interesting path. But beyond that, to better answer your question, joining PE firms in their operations team, I think there's a body of experience that can be very, very helpful and can be made scalable across multiple portfolio companies. Yeah, I think it's a potentially very attractive opportunity. And if you look at the typical profile of ex-consulting, maybe some corporate exposure, then working in transformation, I think it also lends itself well for executive roles. So P&L ownership or strategy come to mind. So I think there's an opportunity there. And then advisory. So I think even in a due diligence phase, a CTO can probably provide a quick read on the team, the potential challenges, the opportunities, and ensure that they get practical during the execution phase, and then other aspects of a transaction, including exits. I think there's a way to advise and support deal and operations teams.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's something that we've seen certainly increased interest, both from sponsors looking to squeeze more value from their existing portfolio companies, and even from the candidate market, as people do start to become more aware of the potential development opportunities and routes beyond being a Chief Transformation Officer. So Geza, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure to sit down with you and spend time talking about such a fascinating and evolving topic, and really, really appreciate your time. And yeah, look forward to when I'm next back in Milwaukee, catching up in person again.
Thank you, Harry.